It was a crisp morning in the city, the kind where the sun was just beginning to break through the clouds, casting a soft, golden light over the streets. Sarah, a woman in her early 30s, impatiently tapped her foot on the curb, checking her watch every few seconds. The taxi she had just called was late. Again. She was already running behind for an important business meeting, one that could change the trajectory of her career. She needed to make a good impression. As she scrolled through her phone, barely paying attention to her surroundings, she heard the rumbling of an engine drawing near. She glanced up, eyes narrowing when she saw the shabby, old yellow cab creeping toward her. Its paint was chipped, the tires looked worn, and the exhaust released a puff of smoke with every rev. The car pulled to a stop, and the door clicked open, revealing the driver. A man in his mid-40s with a worn face, graying hair, and a tired look in his eyes. "Good morning," the driver said politely, but Sarah couldn't hide her disappointment. Really?" she muttered under her breath, louder than she intended. She hesitated, then reluctantly slid into the back seat. The moment she buckled her seatbelt, she couldn't resist the temptation to mock him, the frustration of the morning bubbling to the surface. "Does this thing even run properly? It looks like it's barely hanging together. Are you sure you can get me to the meeting on time?" she said, leaning forward with a smirk, eyeing the cracked dashboard. The driver didn't react right away. He simply adjusted the rearview mirror, his hands steady on the wheel. His name was Thomas, and he'd been driving a taxi for nearly 20 years. He'd heard it all, the insults, the complaints, the judgmental comments from people who assumed his life was a failure because of his old car. But he never fought back. He wasn't in the business of fighting. He was in the business of getting people where they needed to go. "I'm sure we'll be fine, ma'am. Let's get you there," he said quietly, starting the engine. Sarah rolled her eyes and settled into her seat, staring out the window, barely giving him a second thought. All she wanted was to get to her meeting, get through the day, and then leave the city behind for good. Her dream job was waiting in a different city, and this meeting was her chance to make it happen. She could already feel the sting of anxiety as her mind raced through the possible outcomes. But something wasn't right. The car seemed to be driving a little faster than expected, gliding smoothly over the streets despite its worn-out exterior. Sarah shifted in her seat, the familiar cityscape passing by quicker than she anticipated. "Wait, what route are we taking?" she asked, her voice tinged with sudden unease. Thomas didn't look at her. "The quickest way, ma'am," Sarah frowned. The street signs were beginning to look unfamiliar. This wasn't the way to the business district. She opened her mouth to ask more questions, but before she could speak, the car turned off onto a winding road, its path now leading toward an area she'd only heard of in gossip, an upscale neighborhood filled with mansions. Her heart skipped a beat. The car pulled up to a towering iron gate, which swung open automatically, revealing a grand mansion in the distance. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Where are we?" she stammered. The taxi came to a stop in front of the massive stone steps leading up to the grand entrance. The mansion loomed in the distance, its windows sparkling in the sunlight. She couldn't believe her eyes. This is your house?" Sarah whispered, unable to hide the astonishment in her voice. Thomas smiled softly, his weathered eyes flickering with a hint of pride. "This is where I work, ma'am." She stared at him in disbelief. "You? What do you mean? You're a driver. You work for the taxi company." "I don't understand." Thomas turned to face her, the faintest glimmer of amusement in his gaze. "I'm actually the owner of this mansion, and the taxi company, too. I built it from the ground up, one ride at a time. This car may be old, but it's reliable, just like me." Sarah's face flushed with embarrassment. She had spent the entire ride belittling him, mocking his car, judging him based on nothing but his appearance and the state of his vehicle. But now, standing in front of this opulent mansion, she realized how wrong she had been. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice faltering. "I didn't know." Thomas chuckled softly, getting out of the car and walking toward the mansion's entrance. "Most people don't. They see the surface, but they never look deeper. It's easy to assume. But I've found that kindness and respect go much further than judgments and assumptions. As he reached the door, he turned back to her, his smile still there. Good luck with your meeting, ma'am. I hope it goes well for you. The heavy gates slowly closed behind him, leaving Sarah standing in stunned silence by the taxi. She felt the weight of her words, the sting of her assumptions, and the humbling realization that appearances didn't tell the full story. And as she stood there, waiting for the gate to open again, she knew that this encounter, this single moment, would forever change the way she looked at the world.